Alhamdulillahi wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Appreciate Rami the introduction, but again, just to basically summarize, I'm someone who really enjoys generating impact, right? Scaling growth. And alhamdulillah for all of us in the fundraising space, or those of you that are not in the fundraising space, you know this is basically the core essence of our work. How do we take what we're doing as an organization, package it, and make it resonate and relevant for the donors in the community? So very excited. Alhamdulillah, the structure of this webinar is meant to focus on mistakes many of us as organizations are making, focusing on the number one mistake, and then more importantly, talk about some of the solutions that are there to ensure that we stop making those mistakes and start progressing and scaling our fund development plans. So with that, we'll go ahead and kick it off and we'll move to the next slide. So the first thing we want to identify are what are the stakes of mistakes in fund development? By us partaking in these mistakes, what's happening? Number one, we're undermining the trust with our donors, right? Remember, 64% of donors who give to an organization the first time, they do so because of the branding or the trust associated with that organization. So when we're making these mistakes, it undermines the trust, which inherently hurts the brand. One of the things Warren Buffett says that really resonates with me when I think of organizations and fundraising is it takes 20 years to build a reputation and only 5 minutes to ruin it. Very similarly, that first interaction, engagement that a donor has with our organization, it sets up the precedent for years to come. It also prevents donor connection, right? When we're making these mistakes, we're unable to connect, right? I don't care what school you go to and learn about fund development, everyone's going to tell you fundraising equals relationships. So if you're not connecting with donors, you're missing the ship, right? You're not going to be growing and scaling. And lastly, it stunts sustainability, right? If we're making these mistakes, we're preventing growth, and we'll talk more about that as we jump into the next slide. So what are the 5 mistakes? Obviously, we're going to highlight and focus on mistake number 1. But again, every organization is unique. Even though we're going to talk about the number 1 mistake, maybe your organization is doing 3, 2, and number 5, right? So we're going to focus on 5 high-level mistakes majority of organizations are making, and then talk about the solution to preventing us from doing that moving forward. So the number 5 mistake that organizations are making is lack of culturally relevant storytelling, right? Now, this word storytelling is being thrown around quite a bit, right? We need to storytell, we need to repackage, we need to make sure that our product or our mission or vision as an organization connects with the donors, connects in a way that they feel like they want to be a stakeholder. So we need to be careful and not use generic appeal language. We need to make sure our messaging is tied to the values of the segment of donor we're targeting. We also want to make sure that not only are we relevant in our storytelling, but we're relevant in world affairs, right? One of the things, for example, an Islamic school may ask is, Brother Nadeem, how do I make my Islamic school relevant sitting in the state of Detroit, Michigan, when there's a genocide going on in Palestine? And my answer to them is a toolkit. Why not academically create something that educates schools on how to address this topic that the whole world is thinking about, right? Remember, we want to be genuine and ethical in our fundraising, but there are avenues and ways to make ourselves relevant based on what's going on in the world. So this unique area of packaging. Secondly, we also have to take into account urgency. I want to give you guys a stat. Now, when an emergency happens or when there's a hot topic in the community or on the news, whether it's civil rights related, whether it's, relief related, the difference between going live at 6 p.m. and 7 p.m. So the organization that starts fundraising 1 hour before in digital fundraising raises an average of $100,000 more. So what does that mean? Time is money, right? So we have to be efficient with a clear message, but also the timing is equally as important. So that is the number 5 mistake, is being culturally relevant and telling stories that resonate on an individual level with the donors. Now moving to number 4, ignoring smaller donors or grassroots supporters. This is an extremely frequently held mistake that a lot of organizations are making. We all know 80% of our donations are coming from our top 20%, right? We all prioritize major donors, major gifts, How do we thank and recognize our donors? But what we forget is most of our major donors started as a small donor. Now, I don't know how many of you know this, but they did a large study, the Muslim Philanthropy Initiative across Muslim nonprofits across the US, and they said 74% of major donors gave a test gift. Now, for those of you that don't know what a test gift is, this is somebody who has big giving potential. They give to an organization for the first time in a small amount to see how the organization is going to handle that gift. Are they going to thank me? Are they going to give proper recognition? How long does it take them to connect the impact of my gift, to the amount I gave? They're looking at how you engage them to test whether they should give you a bigger or larger amount, right? So it's extremely important to understand small gifts are required for sustainability. The other thing I want you to think about is look at the emphasis on recurring donors, right? We all hear this monthly donors, recurring donors. Why is that so important? Remember, major gifts are always going to have a high level of volatility. Sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. Sometimes the business is performing, other times it's not, right? Different policies and legislative shifts happen, and now suddenly donors become hesitant in their spending. So the reason monthly recurring donors, even if they're smaller amounts, is so important is it gives you something that's predictable, it's forecasted, and you can build your infrastructure around that. I want you guys to think how fun would it be to fundraise without having our manager or director or CEO tell us if we don't raise X amount, we're not going to be able to keep the same team. We're not going to be able to do those events we did last Ramadan. We're always operating on a scarcity mindset. Like we need this, otherwise we're not going to make it. We're going to, sunset. We're going to close as an organization. No, that's not the approach to have. So if we focus on those sustainable gifts, we're going to be in a better position to make better strategic decisions moving forward. Moving to mistake number 3, poor donor stewardship, right? One of the number one reasons when we ask donors, why did you stop giving to an organization? They feel like they were ignored. They feel like they were taken for granted. They were sold something else. They received something totally different in exchange, right? Hey, as soon as you donate, you're going to get an impact report. We're going to, invite you to this event. You're going to feel directly connected to the work you're sponsoring. And then they don't hear anything, right? And then this leads to donor attrition, right? We see a lot of Muslim nonprofits struggling with donor retention, right? Remember, it's more expensive to try to acquire a new donor than it is to retain. And it's also very burdensome when we lose donors at the rate we're losing them on a monthly base because of lack of stewardship, right? What are we doing to thank them? How are we automating things? Because we all know we're struggling with capacity. None of us as an organization can say we have all the time in the world to thank every donor the way they deserve to be thanked. Okay, but then what are we doing to automate that? What are we doing to make sure at least certain segments are taken care of on an individual base, right? What systems are we putting in motion to ensure that we prevent, levels of attrition as well as donors just feeling like they're just a number, right? You guys are probably seeing a shift in the fundraising space with the way fundraisers fundraise. It used to be precise, take 10, 15 minutes. It's a numbers game, collect the money and get out of there. But donors aren't resonating with that anymore, right? They want to feel connected to the impact. I want you guys to take, a campaign strategy idea, right? The number one campaigns on digital crowdfunding platforms are the ones that can be quantified, right? $100 feeds a family of 6. $1,000 to the Islamic Center of Rancho Cucamonga empowers converts to educate themselves with a welcome kit for the next 6 months. When you're able to quantify the amount given to the impact, the donors connect. And it makes it easier for them than to give and to give wholeheartedly. Moving to mistake number 2, asking too soon without relationship building. Um, Now, before I get into this one, I want to share a fact with my major gift folks out there. I know a lot of time we stress, I don't know how much to ask this donor. I know they've given big to this charity. I looked them up on a wealth screening tool and I found out they own assets. They have a DAF, a donor advised fund. I know they have money, but this is the first time they're potentially going to gift my organization, and I don't know what amount to ask. Now, I want to share something with you guys. As someone who's been doing major gift solicitation, meeting donors for the last 13 years, the number one thing that upsets a major donor is not asking too much. It's actually asking too little, right? Now, I've had donors tell me, Nadeem, you asked for $25,000. That's great, but don't you know I just funded an endowment? Aren't you aware that I own, six assets? Aren't you familiar with my family foundation that we've been giving to organizations across the US for the last 11 years? Donors want you to ask them, right? There's a myth here that I want to debunk, that if I ask for a big amount, they're going to get offended. No, they're going to get offended if you don't ask for enough. Donors are more willing to come down and bring you to the amount they're willing to give versus you asking for 5,000, because it shows your perception of growth, of sustainability. Remember, there used to be a phase 3, 4 years ago where the only thing nonprofits cared about was their overhead, right? We want to be the overhead that gives, only charges 3%, that charges 9%. Guess what's one of the most important things I hear from major donors? If they hear from an organization that has an overhead of 3%, you know what they tell me? How are they going to sustain? How are they going to scale? How is it that out of all their donations they're collecting, only 3% is being used to invest in the team, to build capacity, and to grow? It doesn't add up, right? So remember, major donors are investors, their mindset, the way they think, their framework. So it's very important to not ask for too little, but rather start the opposite way. Now, again, focusing on this mistake is you have to cultivate and have a relationship with the donor before you go into ask mode, right? You don't want to just meet a donor for the first time. You heard they give a lot of money and assume they're ready to give that a big amount to you, right? Another stat I'll share with you guys is when you're talking to major donors, and you're on a Zoom call, you're on a phone call, you're in a coffee shop, if you find it that you're speaking 90% of the time and they're only speaking 10%, you're messing up. The number one method to secure major gifts is to be a good listener, right? And what I try to tell teams is look at the Socratic method, asking the right questions that prompt emotional responses that will guide you in the direction you need to go to solicit and confirm some level of a gift. So, very important to read the donor, right? The average major gift officer in large organizations that raise 25 million or more do not even make an ask until 1 year of cultivation is completed. Does that mean they're not taking money? If you guys go to your, Muslim nonprofit managers and say, hey, this guy at Oaktree told us we don't have to get money for the first year, they're gonna, get really mad at me. But what I mean by that is read the relationship, identify if they're ready for that ask, and start with a hook ask, right? The other way to engage these level of donors is by getting their feedback. One of the things I always lead with is if I know someone is a philanthropist or they're respected in a certain industry or space, ask them a question about that and see how they can become a stakeholder with their information before you convert them into a financial supporter as well. So, again, build a relationship, assess what level they're at with you and the organization before you make that clear ask. And again, that is mistake number two. And finally, quiet drum roll, mistake number one is neglecting integration of digital and offline channels, right? And I'm going to explain that. Now, remember, the number one goal as a nonprofit that does fundraising is to create a solid, clear, enjoyable donor experience. If the donors have a good experience, not only are they going to give to you, more importantly, they're going to continue to give to you. So the reason the number one mistake I've highlighted here is the integration of digital and offline channels is most organizations think this is two separate things. Oh, this is a digital campaign. This is our offline campaign. This is our event strategy. This is our digital strategy. But in reality, they're one and the same. Now, COVID forced organizations to go digital, and more than 90% of organizations were not ready for digital. And in my assessment, after working with a lot of different organizations, I would still say about 70% of those organizations are taking their offline assets and forcing them online digitally. They're not designing them to be digitally purposed. So if you don't have interconnectivity between what you're doing digitally and offline, you're missing a big pool of funding and support. For example, online campaigns with poor donor thank you flow, right? So, for example, let's say you're a masjid in the month of Ramadan and you do a digital crowdfunding campaign, right? You work with Oak Tree, we advise you, we tell you, you got to go digital. You gotta let people outside of who's coming in the musalla also be able to partake in and donate to your masjid. So you have the digital campaign, they donate to that platform, whether it's LaunchGood or Classy or GoFundMe or whatever tool you're using. But now there's a disconnect in the way you thank them, right? You only thank the people in the musalla when you're making your Taraweeh announcements, but you forget to send recognition online. So there's a disconnect in the way you're recognizing or speaking to those donors. Another example that's on the flip side is offline donors not integrated into the digital system. I want you to imagine now, how are you going to have in-person events, do fundraising, and then individually cultivate and steward every single one of those donors unless I have them systemized in a digital process so that I can automate thank you messages, follow up and invite them to another event. So it's extremely important that the connectivity is there between digital and offline channels. Looking at the next slide, we'll kind of dive a little bit deeper into this, but I wanted to pause very quickly and then we can talk about this in detail during the Q&A structure. Tell me what you guys think. Which of these mistakes is your organization struggling with, right? We talked about 5 different ones. You guys can see the poll on your screen right there. Just hit the one that you feel like resonates the most with something you feel your fund development, your development team is struggling with. I want to see kind of a poll. And again, remember, depending on where you're at as an organization, everyone's going to have different mistakes that they feel like is a pain point that's preventing them to get to that next level. So again, when you get a moment, go ahead and select one of those, and then we can kind of revisit and come back to this when we get into the QA segment. Perfect. Let's move on to the next slide, Rami. All right. So now diving deeper into this number one mistake, this disconnect between digital and offline fundraising. One reason is the post-COVID conversion to digital, right? People were forced online, they weren't ready, they ran with it, they hurt their brand, right? Remember, when you create digital assets, they're designed to be consumed on Facebook, on Instagram, on Snapchat, on TikTok, on Twitter. They're designed for that platform. You can't reprint, repurpose now and send that in a mailer. So intentionally designing things for the correct medium is something our organizations struggle with, right? If you look at organizations that are raising a lot of money, it's because they understand that these are one and the same, right? You have to make sure your digital voice and your offline voice are the same person. One of the things I tell organizations is when you're sending an email, you need to create a character, a persona, whether it's your CEO, it's your fund development manager, it's your program manager, the person who's in the field. Donors want to feel like they're speaking to a person, not to Chat GPT. And that only happens when you have consistency in your digital brand and your offline brand as well. The other thing is one is not successful without the other. There's dependency. The average number of touch points it takes to convert a donor is 7, right? What does that mean? A donor has to see you at Juma. They have to get an email. They have to get a mailer. They have to see an ad. They have to hear about your organization from a friend. So what are these examples of? Digital touch points and in-person touch points. Once you get to an average of 7 of those, you're now able to increase the likelihood of that donor to convert through a donation, right? Now think about it. How many of us have the capacity to meet a donor offline 7 times and expect one gift? It's impossible, right? We're not going to hit our goals, and none of us have the capacity or time to do that. But if we have a digital and offline strategy, the touch points end up yielding conversions a lot quicker. And then finally, sustainability, right? We need to make sure everything we do, we're thinking long term, right? Look at the relief organizations that have jumped up to the next level. We're not worried about feeding the people that need food. We're focused on income generation. How do we empower them with self-generating income so they can sustain and take care of themselves? We're looking at sustainability from the lens of masajids that are not focused on, building new bathrooms, but we're thinking about expanding because of the youth needs, expanding because our sister section is too small, partnering with the city to become a registered food pantry and get additional grant funding to scale our other ideas and projects. People are looking for ideas that are sustainable in nature. This concept of being like an IV drip for the community where when an emergency strikes, we provide aid, but then we wait for, something else to happen and now we help them again. No, those days are gone. So how do we make sure we're sustainable both offline and online is by having a systematic uniform message that allows us to scale outreach without requiring people to be on the ground 24/7. I know organizations that have a four-person development team that are raising $10 million dollars a year. Why? Is it because each one of them have an amazing offline game? No, they know how to connect offline and online. So sustainability is an extremely important function of combating this mistake. Next slide. Why is this the root? So why, out of all the mistakes, why is this one specifically hurting so many organizations, right? You guys know Giving Tuesday data. Every single year, we see more and more global giving online than we've ever seen before. Another myth I want to debunk real quick is elders don't give online. That stat is 100% objectively false. Just using my organization as an example, we've seen in the last 2 years, individuals over the age of 56 now give 62% more mobile than they did 2 years ago. So that means people 56 and above are either giving on their phone, they're comfortable giving on a third party platform, they're not anymore required to send a check in the mail, walk in and give it in person. They only give it at offline gatherings. So it's extremely important to modernize our data. And, unfortunately, a lot of organizations, what we do is we make a lot of decisions from our gut, right? We have a lot of seasoned fundraisers that say, you know, I've been doing this for 25 years and we never raised money doing that. Or, you know what, I've been in this space for 10 years. That doesn't work. Well, guess what? Post COVID, everything has changed. And I highly encourage your organizations to do current day audits on what is working and what's not working, right? We have misconceptions that, lock the doors. We need to raise our goal. It's the month of Ramadan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is counting on you. Give or get out, right? Like, how many of you want Jannah? Raise your hand. Okay, $1,000. Those days are gone, right? When a donor feels pushed into a corner, they're going to leave. So, extremely important as a nonprofit organization to run these campaigns in parallel. So, again, if I'm a masjid, Ramadan is 2 months away. I need to have a pre-Ramadan goal online to raise 150,000. So in the month of Ramadan, I can hit that $500,000 goal because I'm going into the month having already pre-pledged and raised some money online. If I'm an Islamic school, I'm going to tap out to my students and the parents and say, we want to do a peer-to-peer campaign. We're going to award students with an iPad, AirPods, and a Kindle for first, second, and third place. Push your Islamic school to your friends and family and network, and let's help fund this, institution together. You have to use integrated efforts within your united campaign, right? Remember, not all donors interact the same. If I do a poll, some donors love emails, some donors don't open their email. Some donors love mailers. If you send me a mailer, I'm not even, it goes directly into the recycling bin, right? Again, every donor consumes information uniquely. Does that mean we do one or the other? No, it means we need to have a multifaceted approach and the way we target and reach out to donors. And the only way to do this is through an integration of digital and offline channels. And the last thing I'll say here is the results in inefficiency. This results in inefficiency, mixed messaging, and lost donor opportunities, right? Very important. Every time I have an event, every time I do a campaign, I always make sure part of my ask is getting feedback, right? Unfortunately, we as organizations think we know best, right? This is the way donors want to be thanked. This is the way we show impact. One of the best ways you can get someone fully invested in your organization, your mission, is get feedback from them. Now, does that mean you're going to take their feedback and change your whole vision? No. But just going back to what I said a couple slides ago, the power of listening. As a community, we sometimes forget, sometimes people just want to be heard. And this is part of that donor cultivation, that donor investment of relationships. If you listen to someone and they feel heard, guess what? Now they're more susceptible to what you ask them, right? Remember, a lot of fund development is human psychology. If you study the way human psychology, and by the way, this is not a Muslim thing, this is a human thing. So if we invest a little bit more understanding in the way we communicate, we're going to see more responsiveness to our digital, offline, and online efforts. Let's go to the next slide. All right. So why these critical mistakes, just to kind of summarize, I want to make sure you guys leave here with tangible reasons of why you don't want to be in the bucket of any of those five mistakes. You lose momentum by not reinforcing your message across platforms. Very important. Remember, trust, transparency. These are the keywords donors are looking for. If you're saying one thing digital, I'll give you an example. I know some organizations, some masajids, they have phenomenal digital presence. They're extremely cool, trendy. They're on TikTok. They have a youth running their channels. But then when I get their mailer, you know, with all due respect to that masjid, like it looks like it's from 1964, right? It's typed out. There's no images. There's no QR code. There's no clear call to action. There's a break there, right? Are these two people even working at the same institution? And remember, anytime there's a break in communication or alignment, you lose the trust of that donor. Donors feel disconnected. We talked about that. If a donor's disconnected, guess what? They're going to give somewhere else. A lot of organizations will say, Brother Nadeem, we don't want to ask too much. If we have digital messages and emails going and mailers, and now we're doing fundraising in the musalla or at a banquet hall, isn't this too much? You know what I tell them? Guess what? If you don't ask, someone else is asking, right? I work for a nonprofit. I'm asking. If you're not going to ask, Bismillah, move out of the way. I'll ask. So it is a competitive space. So don't feel like asking is burning bridges, but focus on how you frame your ask. Be genuine. You can't track donors' behaviors across channels. If I were to say the number one advantage of digital fundraising over offline is the measurability and trackability. When you do something digitally, you can track it. How many views, how many opens, how many conversions. You can automate, right? You can set up automations. We'll briefly talk about that to make sure that you don't have to do everything ad hoc, right? Someone gives, you write an email, you send it, you reply. This is all things that can be automated in today's, landscape of digital fundraising and digital cultivation. You waste staff time managing siloed campaigns. I've talked to organizations that say, oh, Brother Nadeem, we don't need to learn about digital fundraising. That's marketing and advertising's job. And I tell them, I said, brother or sister, like this is part of fund development. Like you're driving growth as an organization. Yes, we work with marketing and advertising, but from the development mindset, you have to view those departments as functions of development. Marketing and advertising, if someone can tell me a nonprofit that has a marketing or advertising team and the CEO will say there's no goal of growing through marketing and advertising, let me know because I've never met one, right? End of the day, the marketing and advertising is directly connected to growing or sustaining the organization's mission. So very important to have a connected marketing, advertising, and development team in sync. And lastly, you limit the potential to scale recurring or major gifts because the experience is fragmented. Again, we don't have connectivity between our digital process. And remember, major gifts need a certain level of stewardship. They should not be getting automatic messages or automated messages. They should not be feeling like they're they're talking about something that you're sending them one thing in an email, but then you're calling them and mentioning something totally different. There's like a disconnect between the two. So it's extremely important that there's a sync there and everything is interconnected as it should be. Um, just gonna go ahead and pull up the deck. Okay, so all right. So the number one, so now basically I'm gonna give you guys 5 tips that you can take away that's going to optimize your fundraising. So, okay, that's great. We learned the 5 mistakes. We talked a little bit about why disconnect between offline and online is hurting organizations more than anything. Now we're going to talk about the 5 tips to optimize your fundraising. All right. Number one is centralize your donor data. This is extremely, extremely important. I work with organizations that say, Brother Nadeem, what's a CRM? I mean, I don't know what kind of analogy to bring up here, but that's like trying to play baseball without a baseball bat, right? I don't know why I used a baseball example, but Yeah. Using a CRM. How do we centralize our data to ensure that we have a systematic way to identify how did they give, where did they give, and and keep into mind those preferences to make sure that we're able to make strategic decisions and the way we work with them. Number two is tag donors, right? Remember what I said about digital fundraising, measurability, trackability. If you're not tracking as an organization where the money's coming from, you just get excited at seeing money coming in, you're not making strategic decisions and you're not going to be able to make good decisions moving forward because you're not assessing what's working versus what's not working. And then you want to avoid spreadsheets and untracked donations, right? Again, if you're not segmenting your donors, separating them by where they like to give, when do they give their zakat to me, do they not? Those types of preferences, you're missing on a lot of potential funding. Number two, create cross-channel campaigns, right? Have set strategic campaigns you repeat year after year, but always be ready to be dynamic with an emergency campaign based on current events, based on needs, based on things that are happening around in the community. Remember, when we see shifts in presidential administrations, when we see a shift in or an increase in Islamophobia or hate crimes, that dictates the way donors decide to give. So if you're an Islamic school and you see bullying and anti-Muslim rhetoric on the rise, guess what? Donors are thinking about kids and youth. That's the time for an Islamic school to now position themselves at the forefront to be a solution to that. If you're a mosque and you also happen to serve a good number of youth, and we see curriculum in schools getting weirder and weirder by the day, guess what? That's an opportunity for you to launch a campaign that reminds donors that the masjid is not only a house of worship, it's an opportunity our youth can be themselves and foster and cultivate a culture within Islamic principles. So, do you see what I'm trying to say? You have to be consistent on multiple channels, irrespective of what's going on. A clear call to action, be very clear. Sometimes we have a great sales pitch, but then we forget to make the ask. What are you supporting? Where's my money going? Is this an endowment? Is it zakat eligible? Be clear with that call to action. Number three, is automate a multi-touch stewardship plan. Again, I go into a lot of detail with the organizations on this, but technology has come a long way. You can automate and sequence your emails, right? 5 emails sequenced, and they will be sent to different donors depending on the way they engage with your email. So, for example, if I send an email today and Sister Mosina opens it up tomorrow, guess what? In 3 days, she's automatically going to get email number two. If I send the same email to Brother Rami and he doesn't open it for 48 hours, he's going to get resent email number one after a day. So this is all automatic now. This is called sequencing. And this is the technology or an example of the technology that's out there that can sustain and scale our fundraising. And again, I cannot emphasize enough on using tools, right? MailChimp, Constant Contact, whatever third-party crowdfunding platforms you're using, CRMs, integrating your efforts. If you have 6 different technologies and none of them are connected and speaking to each other, you're missing 90% of the value of using those technology and those resources. Tip number four, leverage masjid and event momentum digitally, right? I cannot tell you how many organizations don't collect data. I want everyone to remember this. Data equals money, right? Just talk to foundations, talk to state grants that are giving millions of dollars every year. Data is worth a lot of money. So it's very important, no matter what you're doing, you're constantly acquiring new data. Name, email, phone number, geographical location, ethnicity. The more data you get, the more segmenting you can do, the more conversion you're going to get. QR codes, NFC codes, make it easy to give. I know, alhamdulillah, I see masajids now doing the tap pay, right? Tip tap. As people are leaving for Jummah, after Jummah, they're not going to stop and hear you out and hear about the expansion project. Give them an easy and quick way they can tap their phone. You collect money, they're on their way, right? Is that the way you're going to secure $1,000 gifts? No, but it's a method, right? That ensures the use of technology in a modern way. I can't tell you how many people just tap their phone leaving masajids just because they want to check it out. And guess what? They're converting on a donation each time. And again, you want to capture both donors and warm leads. Not everyone will give today. So we got to have a mindset that data now equals a donation later. And finally, tip number five, analyze and optimize the full journey, right? You want to track donor performance over time. Where are they coming from? Why are they giving? Which events are yielding the best level of success? Remember, if you're not measuring your output, you're not going to know exactly how or what is working, right? Digital fundraisers are very good at what they do because they dynamically assess the data and then they convert and make decisions accordingly. Um, and then the last thing I'll say here that I haven't mentioned is use that data to tailor your follow-up, right? If an online only donor is only given online, the next step should be to invite them to an in-person event. If somebody only attends your annual gala, I want to make sure they join my newsletter so they start hearing about me on a more frequent basis. So using the data and the insights to connect offline and online efforts and campaigns. If you do this, here are the things you're going to get. You're going to get integration. You're going to see increased fundraising, stronger donor relationships. You're going to see higher retention, right? We talked about the attrition of donors. You're going to get better data, which is going to give you better strategic next steps. You're going to see an increase in ROI because end of the day, fund development is about ROI, whether it's money or time or volunteerism or growth or an investment on the board. It is looking at an ROI. And finally, you're going to get a unified brand that has presence across all your platforms. And again, remember, brand equity, brand value is directly correlated to the level a major donor will give to your organization. And I will pause there and throw it back over to Rami.